Today, we are looking at disaster studies, which is a multidisciplinary field that is dedicated entirely to studying disasters. We are going to look at how the field developed, how disasters are actually defined within the field, what counts as a disaster and what doesn't, and what some of the debates are that are taking place today within disaster studies scholarship. So let's get started. As you can imagine, descriptions of disasters have existed since the very earliest human writing. But it was only in the 1920s when the very first systematic studies driven by data and theory started to emerge. In 1920, the book Catastrophe and Social Change was published by Canadian sociologist Samuel Prince. This book focused on the military weapons ship explosion that occurred in Halifax, Canada, in the Central Harbor. Now, two ships collided, leading to this explosion where almost 2,000 people were killed and 9,000 were injured. And this was considered at the time the largest human-made explosion that had ever been documented. And this was a particularly notable book because it was one of the first to connect a physical disaster to societal organization, as well as culture and the long-term impact on social change. Now, of course, there are multiple prongs of disaster studies. You have the physical sciences, the medical sciences, the science of management in terms of managing insurance and risk calculations. And then we are engaging in the social sciences tied to how people make meanings about disasters, how they respond and interpret, and how societies both shape and are shaped by disasters. But Prince's work was actually more of a one-off publication. It wasn't until the 1950s that disaster research as a field started to become institutionalized and more well-known. The formal beginning of this field can be tied to 1949 when the Social Science Disaster Research Group was founded at the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center. And then later in 1963, the Disaster Research Center was launched at Ohio State University. And this center was the first of its kind in the entire world. It was a center devoted specifically to the study of the social and behavioral aspects of disasters. And that was fundamentally unique. Now, let me tell you a story about this center. In 1962, the founders of this center, so 1 year before it opened, submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation in the US requesting $50,000 in support for their disaster studies. And somehow, even though the founders didn't send it to them, the US Office of Civil Defense heard about this proposal. And the Civil Defense Office responded by giving them $1 million. This is closer to $10 million today. Let me tell you, this never happens. When I submit a funding proposal, I rarely get funding from the people I submitted it to, let alone getting $10 million from someone I didn't submit it to. So the Disaster Research Center starts out with millions of dollars from the U.S. Civil Defense Office. They also receive funding from the U.S. Air Force to run a lab simulating people and organizations' responses to disaster-related stress. So the link between the rise of disaster studies and the U.S. military is undeniable. Why does this link matter for us? This link matters because disaster studies was rooted in Cold War politics. The goal of the US military was to predict and also regulate American civilians' reactions to a potential nuclear attack. So think about these dates, 1949 and 1963. Both of these groups and centers start. And the broader context is the US had dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan in 1945 in Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Authorities were trying to plan how to respond if a bomb was dropped on the US. They considered telling the public that it was another type of disaster, like a blizzard or an earthquake, to avoid mass panic. The military leaders wanted to do empirical studies of civilian disasters in order to determine how would the public actually react to nuclear destruction. Would they panic or would they develop styles of coping? And we now know that in response to disasters, people usually act in very pro-social ways, forming new networks and groups to engage in disaster recovery and disaster response. But this wasn't common knowledge at the time. So this military funding led to some limitations in the development of the field over the next half century. The first limitation is in the definition of a disaster itself. Charles Fritz, who was a key player in establishing the NORC disaster teams, wrote the most well-known definition of a disaster as, quote, an event concentrated in time and space in which a society or a relatively self-sufficient subdivision of a society undergoes severe danger and incurs such losses to its members and physical appurtenances, which is just a fancy way of saying buildings, technology, and infrastructure, that the social structure is disrupted and the fulfillment of all or some of the essential functions of the society is prevented. What do you think are some assumptions that are built into this particular definition of disaster? I'm about to identify some of those assumptions for you, so pause this lecture if you would like a little more time to think about it. So the first implication is that this definition aligned with US government and military objectives by focusing on disasters that were sudden onset in one particular place. Disasters like bombs, earthquakes, tornadoes, and so on. In other words, disasters that appear to be geographically and spatially bounded. They were less concerned at the time with slow disasters like gradual health decay and death from toxins in the environment, because it wasn't believed to incite collective panic in the same way as a bomb. This focus comes back to the positioning of the funders. Government and military were interested in governing and maintaining social order, and they were worried about collective stress and collective panic, which would lead to societal breakdown. The requirement that disasters be concentrated in time and space is also a key reason why pandemics were not originally included in disaster research. COVID-19, for example, was really messy in terms of its temporality. When exactly did it start? Was it in December 2019 when cases were discovered? Or was it actually before then when the disease was spreading but it hadn't been given a name? Or was it on March 11th, 2020 when it was officially declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization? COVID also wasn't concentrated in space. It spread regionally and then nationally and internationally and impacted different societies at different points in time. So it wouldn't really qualify as a disaster under this limited definition. But this traditional definition has since been expanded to include more diffuse and slowly developing disasters, things like famines, droughts, epidemics, and pandemics. The second assumption is that disasters disrupt otherwise functional societies. And therefore, the focus of disaster research should be studying how communities and organizations respond to disasters and eventually restore order and function. Sociologist Kathleen Tierney explains that it was the structural functionalist tradition in sociology that shaped this initial focus. If structural functionalism is a new term for you, I'll just give you a brief background. So structural functionalism was a popular approach in the US from about the 1930s to the 1950s. And this approach sees society as a system with different parts that work together to maintain the function of the whole. The parts of the system were social institutions that each had a purpose, like the education system is a social institution, and it socializes the next generation. And the economy is a social institution, and it ensures the production and distribution of goods and services. Early disaster studies scholars believed that communities were systems organized around the performance of key societal functions. A disaster is therefore a damaging event that disrupts the operation of the system, making such functions impossible to perform. The earliest disaster studies researchers in the 50s and 60s asked questions like, how do organizations and communities come up with ways of coping with the dysfunction when a disaster hits, and what do they do to restore function and social order? And we hear some of this discourse in questions about returning to normal post-COVID. But more critical scholars would ask, was the so-called normal working that well for everyone even before COVID or another disaster hit? Early disaster studies scholars also didn't ask how societies were set up before disasters in ways that made some groups more vulnerable to being exposed to disasters and suffering negative short and long-term impacts. So while we owe a great deal to the funders and researchers who had the innovation and foresight to study the behavioral components of disasters, it's important to recognize that the dominant definition of disaster in the field, at least traditionally, was limited types of disasters and certain types of foci.